The knock arrived not as a request, but as an intrusion, a heavy, wet thudding against the oak that vibrated through the floorboards and straight into the soles of Arnold's slippers. He did not look up from the ledger immediately, allowing the nib of his pen to scratch a final correction regarding the burial fees for the Stepney pauper while the ink glistened black in the gaslight. He capped the bottle with a sharp click that sounded too loud in the quiet study, outside of which the Vincent Square fog pressed against the sash windows like a grey, suffocating wool that swallowed the garden railings and turned the morning into a premature twilight. It was the smell, however, that betrayed the visitor before the door even opened, a sweet and cloying heaviness reminiscent of flesh that had spent too long in the brackish embrace of the Thames, a scent no amount of lavender water or closed windows could entirely keep at bay. Arnold stood, his joints protesting with a dry grinding in the knees that reminded him he was 52 and not 20, signaling that the damp of London lived in the cartilage now as much as in the brickwork. He crossed the room, where the Persian rug muffled his steps, and pulled the door open to reveal Constable Miller on the threshold, shovel in hand and uniform coat buttoned wrong at the collar. The man's face was the color of wet ash, eyes wide and fixed on a point somewhere over Arnold's left shoulder, as if looking directly at the surgeon might transfer the contamination. "Doctor," Miller croaked, the word catching in a throat tight with suppressed vomit. "Horseferry, they've brought another." Arnold did not ask where, for there was only one place the river delivered its parcels this time of year. He stepped past the constable, grabbing his hat and coat from the stand in a single fluid motion, the wool heavy and cold against his neck. "Make way, Miller, for if you stand there gaping, the smell shall follow us all the way to the cab." Miller flinched, stepping back onto the pavement where his boots slipped slightly on the slick cobblestones. He tried to speak again, perhaps to offer a warning about the state of the remains, but Arnold was already descending the steps, the iron railing cold under his gloved palm while the fog curled around his ankles, indifferent to the hurry in his stride. A hansom cab waited at the corner, the horse steam-breathing into the chill air, its driver huddled deep within a collar of matted fur. "Horseferry Road," Arnold barked, throwing the door open, "and drive as if the devil himself is paying the fare." The journey was a blur of grey mist and rhythmic clatter, the wheels iron-shod and loud on the empty streets. Arnold stared out the window, watching the gas lamps dissolve into halos of sickly yellow before vanishing entirely into the gloom. He thought of the ledger back in the study, the neat columns of names and dates, and how useless they were against the reality waiting on the slab. For names required faces and faces required heads, which the Thames, in its infinite, tidal cruelty, rarely provided in the same bundle. When the cab lurched to a halt outside the mortuary, the air inside the vehicle shifted, growing thick and greasy. Arnold paid the driver with a coin that felt too small for the service, then pushed open the door to the building. Miller was there again, having somehow arrived ahead, standing guard by the entrance with his shovel held like a spear. He did not move when Arnold approached. "Constable," Arnold said, stopping inches from the man's chest, "step aside." I thought you should know, Doctor," Miller stammered, his gaze dropping to the muddy toes of Arnold's boots. "It's bad, worse than the one from last week. The lads, they couldn't bring themselves to unwrap it fully." "The lads are paid to carry, not to examine," Arnold snapped. He placed a hand on the shovel's wooden handle, feeling the rough grain against his palm, and pushed. The wood groaned, and Miller stumbled back, yielding the doorway with a look of profound relief. The interior of the mortuary assaulted Arnold with a physical weight, the carbolic acid having been laid on thick to create a stinging, chemical sharpness that burned the nostrils. Beneath lay the underlying sweetness of decay, heavy and undeniable, resembling the smell of a butcher's shop left uncleaned in high summer, amplified by the damp stone walls. A single gas jet hissed above the central table, casting a sickly, fluctuating glare upon the white enamel slab. On it lay a bundle wrapped in coarse sacking, tied with rough twine that had swollen dark with river water. The fabric dripped steadily onto the tiled floor, plip, 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 a slow, rhythmic counting of the seconds wasted. Arnold moved to the basin, pumping the handle of the tap until cold water surged out. He scrubbed his hands, the soap gritty and harsh, rinsing away the residue of his study, the ink, the domestic dust. He dried them on a towel that was already stiff with previous use, then turned to the slab. "Get the scales," he ordered, though there was no one else in the room but the silent dead and the ghost of his own frustration. He spoke to the air, to the routine, to the necessity of filling the silence. "And fetch Clerk Henderson. If he is drinking tea in the annex, tell him his salary stops the moment this knife touches the twine." He picked up the scalpel from the tray. The steel was cold, biting into his gloved fingers. With a precise, economical motion, he sliced through the swollen knot of the twine. The sound was a wet tear, fibers snapping under the tension. He peeled back the sacking. The skin was grey, bloated to a terrifying translucence, the texture of overripe fruit. Water poured from the incisions, pooling on the enamel. Arnold leaned in, his breath held tight in his chest, not from revulsion, for he had long since cauterized that reflex, but from the intense, narrowing focus required to reconstruct a soul from shattered pieces while the river kept its secrets close. The coal smoke did not merely hang over the Thames, it pressed against the glass of the hansom cab like a physical weight, greasy and thick enough to taste on the back of the tongue. Arnold wiped the pane with a gloved thumb, clearing a smudge only to watch the grey fog swallow the view anew. Wheels clattered over cobbles, a rhythmic iron-shod pounding that vibrated up through the seat and into the spine, matching the yen e grave o beat of his own impatience. He needed the second parcel. The first lay open on his slab back at Horseferry, its secrets leaking onto the enamel, but without its counterpart from Chelsea, the anatomy remained a sentence missing its verb. "Driver," Arnold called out, leaning forward to tap the roof with his cane. "Faster, the tide waits for no man, and neither does rot." The cab lurched, horses straining against the bit as they navigated the narrow throat of the wharf entrance. Chelsea Old Church loomed out of the mist, a dark finger pointing at the obscured sky, while the warehouses stretched long shadows over the water's edge like grasping fingers. When the vehicle halted, Arnold did not wait for the step to be lowered. He shoved the door open, his boot finding the slick pavement with a slip that nearly sent him sprawling into the gutter. He righted himself, adjusting the lapels of his coat against the damp chill that seeped through the wool. The Thames Division office sat tucked behind a stack of rotting crates, the wood blackened by years of river spray. Inside, the air stagnated, heavy with the smell of stale tobacco smoke and wet ink. Inspector Thorne sat behind a desk cluttered with ledgers, his face flushed from drink or warmth, possibly both. He did not look up when Arnold entered. "Superintendent's away," Thorne said, dipping a pen into an inkwell that looked crusted with dried use. "No releases without a signature." "The signature is on the telegram sent this morning," Arnold replied, stepping closer to the desk. He placed his gloved hands on the wood, leaning in until his shadow fell across the open ledger. "Or has the post office begun holding mail specific to H Division?" Thorne finally lifted his gaze, eyes narrow and bloodshot. He twirled the pen between thick fingers, a nervous habit that spoke of a man guarding a gate he had no key for. "Telegrams misfiled. Happens. You know how it is down here, Doctor. Paperwork gets damp, ink runs. Then write me a new order." "Can't do that." Thorne leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "Chain of command, Arnold. You know the rules. Surrey fines go to Surrey, Middlesex fines go to Middlesex. This lot washed up on the Chelsea shore. That's my jurisdiction until the coroner says otherwise." "The coroner waits for me," Arnold said, his voice dropping to a low, clinical register that cut through the room's haze. "And the body waits for no one. You hold this parcel here, you are not protecting jurisdiction. You are aiding the destruction of evidence." He reached into his pocket and withdrew his own notebook, flipping it open to a page filled with dense, cramped script. He tapped a line of figures. "I have the time of recovery logged. I have the tidal state calculated. What I do not have is the physical remains sitting in your storeroom while you worry about which stamp goes on which form." Thorne stood, pushing the chair back with a scrape that set Arnold's teeth on edge. He was a large man, broad-shouldered from years of hauling drunks from the embankment, and he used that bulk now, stepping around the desk to loom over the surgeon. "You think you're the only one with rules, Doctor? Thames Police have their own. You take that box without my say, I report it as theft. You lose your badge, I keep my job. Report it, Arnold said, refusing to step back. He met the inspector's gaze, holding it with the cold detachment he reserved for the most necrotic of tissues. Tell them Thomas Arnold removed a decomposing human torso to prevent a public health hazard. See if the Metropolitan Police cares more about your ledger or the cholera risk. He moved past Thorne, brushing the man's shoulder with a deliberate lack of apology. The storeroom door stood unlatched at the back of the office, a dark mouth waiting to be fed. Arnold pushed it open. Inside, the smell hit him first a brine, old blood, and the sweet, cloying odor of advanced decomposition that no amount of carbolic could mask. The parcel sat on a wooden trestle, wrapped in the same coarse sacking as the Battersea find, tied with identical rough twine. He lifted it. It was heavier than it looked, the weight shifting within the sack like liquid. Take it, Thorne called from the doorway, his voice stripped of its earlier bluster. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching Arnold with a mixture of resentment and relief. Just sign the log. Don't say I gave it to you, say you took it. Arnold did not answer. He signed the book with a swift, jagged stroke, the pen tearing the paper slightly, then tucked the parcel under his arm. The wet canvas soaked into his coat sleeve immediately, leaving a dark stain that would not wash out. He walked back out into the wharf, the fog closing around him like a curtain drawn tight. The air outside felt cleaner than the office, though it carried the raw scent of the river mud. He did not head for the cab, not yet. He walked to the edge of the embankment, where the stone gave way to the slick, sucking mud of the shore. The tide was low, exposing the debris of the riverbed of broken bottles, rusted hoops, the bleached bones of small animals. He crouched, ignoring the damp seeping through his trousers, and ran a gloved finger over the mud where the water line sat. It was gritty, abrasive, mixed with something finer than sand, coal dust, industrial runoff. He rubbed the grit between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the texture, committing it to memory before the next tide washed it clean. This was where the package had lain. This was the last solid ground the woman had known before the water took her. Arnold stood, wiping his hand on a handkerchief that was already stiff with previous use. The parcel under his arm felt cold, leaching the warmth from his side. He turned back towards the cab, the driver waiting patiently in the mist, but his eyes lingered on the mud one last time. There was something there, half buried near the water's edge, catching the faint light of a distant gas lamp. Not stone, not bone, something metallic, glinting like a promise or a threat. The glint vanished under a shift of the mist, swallowed by the grey before Arnold could step closer to pry it from the sludge. He hesitated, one boot hovering over the sucking mud, the parcel heavy against his ribs like a second, dead heart. To leave it was negligence. To retrieve it was to delay the examination of the flesh he already carried, flesh that ticked away its 48 hours of viability with every sluggish beat of his own pulse. The river breathed out, a wet, rattling exhalation that coated his face in saline mist, and he made his choice. He turned his back on the water's edge, the metallic promise buried once more, and climbed into the hansom. Home, he told the driver, his voice rough. Horseferry Road, and drive as if the devil himself sits behind you. The cab lurched forward, the wheels biting into the cobbles, but the journey back felt slower than the approach, the city's arteries clogged with the evening's congestion. Arnold held the parcel on his knees, isolating it from his body as much as the cramped space allowed, yet the cold seeped through the wool of his trousers, a damp chill that settled deep in the marrow. He stared at the twine binding the sack, the rough fibers dark with river water, and traced the knot with a gloved thumb. It was a surgeon's knot, precise and tight, pulled with a strength that suggested a hand accustomed to heavy labor or perhaps the steady grip of a butcher. The same knot as the Battersea find, the same sacking, the same brutal efficiency. The carriage rattled over the bridge, the Thames flowing black and silent beneath the arches, indifferent to the cargo it had surrendered. Arnold closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to visualize the slab waiting for him in the gaslit sterility of the mortuary. He saw the first torso, already partially dissected, the skin pale and waxy under the yellow glare, the ribs exposed like the timbers of a wrecked ship. He saw the empty space beside it, a void demanding to be filled, a silence screaming for a counterpart. If the river had delivered them in pieces, scattered by jurisdiction and tide, it was his duty to reassemble the truth, however fragmented. When the cab finally halted outside the H Division mortuary, the building loomed out of the fog, a brick fortress guarding its grim secrets. Miller was there, shovel in hand, pacing the pavement with a restless energy that belied the late hour. He stopped as Arnold stepped down, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the second parcel. "Another one, sir?" Miller asked, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might wake the dead inside. "They come faster than the burying parties can dig." "Bring the trestle to the main slab," Arnold ordered as he brushed past him, adding that they must boil more water because there was no time for the usual delays. Inside, the air hung heavy, a thick soup of carbolic acid struggling vainly against the sweet, cloying odor of decomposition that rose from the ventilation grates. Arnold laid the Chelsea parcel on the iron trestle beside the Battersea remains, the two bundles sitting side by side like grotesque twins. He stripped off his coat, tossing it onto a chair, and rolled up his sleeves, exposing forearms pale against the dark stain of his shirt cuffs. The gas jet hissed above, casting long, dancing shadows that made the white enamel slab seem to ripple. "Cut it," he commanded, though there was no one else to obey but the silence. He picked up the scalpel himself, the steel cold and sharp in his grip. He sliced through the twine, the sound loud in the quiet room, then peeled back the wet canvas. The smell bloomed instantly, richer and more foul than the first, a punch of brine and rot that made his eyes water. He did not flinch. He worked with methodical speed, unfolding the tissue, revealing the second torso. It was a mirror of the first in its mutilation, the edges of the wounds clean and sharp, sliced with the same industrial precision that had separated the head from the shoulders and the limbs from the trunk. Arnold stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked at the two halves of a woman laid out before him. They were not two victims, they were one. He reached for the calipers, the metal cool against his fingertips, and began to measure. The width of the pelvis matched exactly. The distance between the ribcage and the iliac crest was identical. He leaned in closer, ignoring the stench, his nose inches from the exposed liver of the Chelsea find. There, on the convex surface of the organ, was a scar, a jagged, white line, old and healed, as distinct as a thumb mark. He moved to the Battersea torso, lifting the flap of tissue he had reflected earlier to expose the same organ. The scar was there, matching in length, in curve, in the precise way it dipped near the ligament. His breath caught, a sharp intake of tainted air that lodged in his throat. "Elizabeth Jackson," he whispered, the name feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. It was the only name they had, anchored by the distinctive mole on the thigh of the first find, a mark identified by a grieving sister who had come forward 3 days prior. But Thesa, this changed everything. This was not a series of random tragedies, separate misfortunes scattered along the river's bend. This was a single woman, dismantled with surgical care and deposited in 2 different jurisdictions to ensure she would never be whole again in the eyes of the law. He grabbed a sheet of paper, his hand trembling slightly as he dipped the pen. He began to write, the nib scratching furiously against the fiber, drafting a unified report that would connect the Battersea and Chelsea finds, demanding a single investigation, a single pursuit of the butcher who had done this. He detailed the scars, the measurements, the identical twine, the shared sacking. He wrote until his hand cramped, the ink pooling in thick, black loops that spoke of his urgency. It was done within the hour. He sealed the envelope, addressing it directly to the superintendent of H Division, and placed it on the outgoing tray before collapsing into his chair. The fire in the grate had died to embers, the room growing cold, but he did not move to stoke it. He waited. The response came before dawn. A clerk, young and nervous, placed the envelope back on Arnold's desk. The seal was broken. Inside, his report was annotated in red ink, a single, dismissive note scrawled across the bottom in the superintendent's bold, authoritative hand. Treat as separate incidents, no evidence of connection beyond conjecture. Public alarm must be avoided. File accordingly. Arnold stared at the words, the red ink bleeding slightly into the paper like a fresh wound. Separate incidents, as if the river cared for borders drawn on a map. as if a woman could be cut in half and remain two different people depending on which shore her parts washed up on. He felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but it died quickly, suffocated by the weight of the bureaucracy that surrounded him, a wall of indifference higher than any he could scale. He stood walking to his private desk in the corner of the office. He opened the top drawer, the key turning with a soft click, and placed the rejected report inside, beneath a stack of older, unsolved files. Then he reached for a fresh notebook, one with no official letterhead, no police stamp, no record in the Metropolitan Archives. He opened it to the first page, dipped his pen in the inkwell, and began to write the truth. October 14th, 1887. Though the law sees two cases, I see one murder, for the remains found at Battersea and Chelsea are one and the same. Elizabeth Jackson, dismembered by a single hand. He wrote on, the scratching of the nib the only sound in the silent mortuary, preserving the evidence that the city refused to see, while outside, the fog continued to roll off the Thames, hiding the living and the dead in equal measure. The nib scratched its final stop, a hard dot that anchored the lie he had just told himself. Truth, rather, the only truth that mattered now lived in the leather-bound book locked inside the drawer, while the official ledger remained a testament to bureaucratic blindness. Arnold closed the journal, the leather cover side, a soft exhalation of bound paper and secret ink. He turned the key, the metal cold against his thumb, and slid the drawer shut until it clicked. Room temperature dropped the instant he moved away from the grate. Carbolic acid strung the back of his throat, sharp and chemical, battling the underlying sweetness of the slab. He walked back to the center of the room, his boots clicking on the tiled floor, each step echoing off the white enamel walls. The remains lay waiting. In the first light of the reconstruction, he had joined the torso to the pelvis, but the legs remained separate entities, pinned to the waxed board with brass rods that glinted dull yellow under the gas jet. Silk thread, black and fine, cinched the severed thigh muscles to the hip joints, holding the sagging flesh in a grotesque approximation of stance. Miller stood by the sink, scrubbing a tray with a wire brush. The screech of metal on metal ceased as Arnold approached. "Still with us, then?" Miller asked, not looking up. He dipped the brush into the bucket, the water turning a cloudy gray. "She is not going anywhere, Miller, not until I say so." Arnold pulled the rubber apron tighter around his waist. The material cracked, dry-rotted at the folds. He leaned over the lower limbs. The skin was marbled, purple veins branching like river deltas across the pale surface, but the structure held. He had aligned the femur fractures earlier, matching the jagged bone ends like broken china, yet he had skipped the lower extremities in his rush to confirm the torso identity. Now, with the superintendent's red ink burning in his memory, he needed more. He needed a mark that belonged to the living woman, not just the dead meat. He took the probe, steel, blunt-tipped. "Find something else, sir." Miller wiped his hands on a rag that was dirtier than his skin, thought the liver mark settled it. "The liver tells me she was one person, yet it does not tell me who she was before the water took her." As Arnold ran the probe down the shin of the left leg, the tissue yielded slightly, soft as overripe fruit. The sister identified a mole, but moles fade and moles rot, so I need something deeper. He worked the probe around the knee joint. The patella was visible beneath the thinning dermis, a smooth stone under silk. He pressed harder, searching for irregularities in the texture, any deviation from the smooth decay. Half an inch above the joint line, the skin changed. It wasn't marbling, it wasn't bruising. A line, thin, white, distinct against the purple-gray. Arnold stopped breathing. He leaned in, his nose inches from the cold flesh, ignoring the stench of tidal mud that clung to the pores. The line was straight, precise, no more than 2 inches long. The edges were healed, rolled slightly, the tissue beneath hardened into a ridge. This was not a wound from the river. This was not a tear from the propeller of a barge. "Miller, the light." Miller shuffled over, holding the lantern higher. The flame guttered, casting long shadows that stretched across the slab like reaching fingers. "See this?" Arnold traced the scar with a gloved finger, noting the clean incision. Although the suturing marks are faint, they are present. This was closed by a surgeon, someone with a steady hand and proper wire. "Old wound. Months, years. Arnold straightened, his back cracking with the movement. People do not carry surgical scars unless they have been inside a hospital. St. Thomas's, Westminster, guys, they keep logs, admission books, surgical registers. Miller frowned, scraping his chin with a thumbnail. Logs don't talk, sir, not to us, and not about the dead. This one might, if I can match the scar to a procedure. I have a name that does not rely on a grieving sister's memory. Arnold felt a surge of energy, sharp and electric, cutting through the fatigue that had settled in his bones since midnight. A mole is chance. A surgical scar is record. It is bureaucracy fighting bureaucracy. He grabbed the magnifying glass from the tray, the brass rim warm from the gas heat. Through the lens, the scar looked even more deliberate. A ligament repair, a removal of a growth. The precision suggested a hospital environment, not a backstreet butcher. Hope, dangerous and fragile, bloomed in his chest. It was a thread, thin as the silk holding the leg to the hip, but it was a thread he could pull. If he could visit the infirmaries before the burial order was executed, he might find the entry. Elizabeth Jackson, admission date, surgeon's name. "You're chasing ghosts, Doctor," Miller said as he turned back to the sink. He picked up the brush again, yet he didn't scrub. "Police won't wait, nor will the magistrate, for the earth wants her back." "The earth can wait 12 hours. Can it?" Miller's voice dropped, low and rough. "Cart comes at 6. You know the rules, sanitary imperative. She smells too sweet already." Arnold ignored him. He reached for his notebook, the official one, and began to sketch the scar. He measured the distance from the patella. He noted the angle. He wrote down the potential hospitals in a column on the page, the ink flowing faster now, driven by the sudden possibility of a name anchored in fact rather than conjecture. The silence of the slab felt different now. It was no longer a tomb, it was a waiting room. He capped the pen. The room felt colder. Above them, the gas jet hissed. The flame shrank, turning from a steady blue cone to a wavering orange tip. The pressure dropped. Shadows lengthened, dancing wildly across the white tiles as the light dimmed to a sickly glow. Arnold looked up, squinting against the sudden gloom. The mantle flickered, sputtering as if choking on its own fuel. "Main pressure dropping," Miller said, his voice echoing through the dimming room as if the walls themselves were swallowing the light. "It happens when the factories kick in downriver, or perhaps simply when the morning begins." Arnold shielded the sketch from the dark. He needed light to finish the measurement. He needed light to see the truth before the city woke up and demanded the body be buried. He reached for the candle on the side table, his hand trembling slightly as he struck the match. The flame caught, small and defiant against the encroaching gray of the mortuary dawn. "Get me another candle, Miller, all of them." Miller hesitated, the brush hovering over the bucket. "Sir, if the gas goes out completely." "Light," Arnold said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Now." Miller moved to the cupboard, but the gas jet gave a final, wet cough. The flame vanished. Darkness swallowed the slab, the pins, the silk thread, and the scar that might yet speak a name. Only the match in Arnold's hand remained, burning down towards his fingers, casting a single trembling circle of light over the left knee of Elizabeth Jackson. The wax bit into his thumb. He did not flinch. Arnold touched the flame to the first wick, then the second, until 3 yellow spheres of light pushed back the gloom, though the corners of the mortuary remained swallowed by a thick, oily dark. The candles sputtered, smelling of tallow and old dust, a domestic scent that clashed violently with the sweet, cloying rot rising from the slab. Under this weaker illumination, the reconstructed form of Elizabeth Jackson shifted. The shadows cast by the pinned limbs stretched and contracted with the flicker, making the dead flesh appear to breathe, to twitch, as if the silk threads holding her together were puppet strings pulled by an unseen hand. Miller struck another match, his hands shaking enough to waste 2 before the third caught. He placed the new candle near the foot of the slab, then stepped back, wiping his palms on his apron. "Can't work like this, Doctor. The shadows lie." "The shadows are all we have." Arnold leaned over the knee, shielding the flame with a cupped hand. The scar stood out now, a pale river against the purple map of the leg, but the light was treacherous. It hid the depth of the suture marks, turning the ridges into flat lines. He needed precision. He needed the nib to catch every irregularity. He dipped the pen into the inkwell, the metal scratching against the glass, and brought the tip to the paper. The ink flowed too fast. A blob formed, threatening to ruin the sketch. "Steady," Miller whispered, though he made no move to help. He stood by the sink, watching the door as if expecting the police to burst through it at any second. "Undertaker comes at 6. Bell rings, I open. That's the arrangement." "Let him ring." "He won't wait for a bell, knocking instead until the wood splits." Miller kicked at a bucket, the metal scraping loudly against the tile. "You know what happens if the magistrate finds out we held her? They'll say we neglected the sanitary codes, accusing you of hoarding flesh." "I am preserving evidence." "You're preserving a smell." Miller gagged, actually gagged, turning his head towards the window where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. "It's changing, the heat from the candles. It's waking her up." Arnold ignored him. He focused on the angle of the incision, 15 degrees, oblique, consistent with a lateral approach to the joint. His hand moved across the page, scratching out the measurements, the sound of the nib the only rhythm in the room besides the drip of the tap Miller had forgotten to tighten. Each drop echoed like a pistol shot. Plip, plip, plip. Outside, the city began to turn over. A cart rumbled in the distance, iron rims grinding on cobblestones. A horse whinnied, sharp and lonely. The morning was coming, grey and indifferent, bringing with it the bureaucracy of burial that cared nothing for scars or surgical wire. Arnold felt the weight of it in his shoulders, a physical pressure pushing him towards the door, towards the safety of his study where the dead stayed on paper and did not smell of the tide. He looked at the leg again. The skin was blistering now, reacting to the warmth of the candles, the epidermis lifting like wet paper. Time was eating the clue. Miller passed the calipers. "They're cold, you'll shock the tissue." "Pass them." Miller hesitated, then reached for the brass instrument on the tray. He handed it over without meeting Arnold's eyes, his fingers withdrawing quickly as if the metal were contaminated. Arnold measured the width of the scar, 2 lines. He wrote it down. The ink was smudging where his hand rested on the page. "This is it," Arnold said, more to himself than the assistant, knowing that if he loses this, he loses her. She becomes unknown female number 4. She becomes Ash. "She's already Ash, Doctor, just hasn't been buried yet." The cruelty of it landed hard, but Arnold did not look up. He knew Miller was right in the eyes of the law. The sanitary imperative demanded the earth close over the risk of cholera, over the offense to the living nose, regardless of the justice owed to the dead throat. But the scar was a signature. It was a name waiting to be spoken. To bury it now would be a murder of a different kind, committed by ink and order rather than knife and wire. He capped the pen. The light was failing again. The candles had burned down an inch in 20 minutes. The wax pooled around the bases, hardening into white ridges. "Put the screen up," Arnold ordered. "Block the draft." "Draft's coming from the door," Miller said. "Someone's out there." Arnold froze. He listened. Beyond the drip of the tap, beyond the settling of the building, there was a sound. Wheels, slow, heavy, stopping directly outside. The creak of leather harness. The stamp of a horse impatient to be moving again. Miller moved to the door, his hand hovering over the latch. 6 o'clock. "Not yet." "Close enough for government work." Miller looked back, his face grey in the candlelight. "You want to stand in front of the coffin, Doctor? You best decide now. Once I open this, she belongs to the ground." Arnold looked at the sketch. The scar was recorded, but the body remained. He needed the body intact for the magistrate's review, needed to show them the wire, the precision, the impossibility of this being a common drowning. He needed 12 hours. He needed to walk to Westminster before the cart took her to the pit. He stood up, his knees clicked. The cold from the floor had seeped into his boots, numbing his toes. He walked to the slab and placed his hand on the sheet covering the torso, feeling the hardness of the pins beneath the linen. "Lock the door, Miller." Miller's eyes widened. "Sir." "Lock it. Tell them I am still examining. Tell them there is a risk of infection." Arnold moved to the side of the slab, positioning himself between the door and the remains. "I will not move until I have the order signed." You can't stop them. Watch me. The knock came, 3 heavy blows that shook the frame, sending a tremor through the floorboards that vibrated up through the soles of Arnold's shoes. Dust fell from the ceiling. The candle flame danced wildly, throwing the shadow of the surgeon large and distorted against the wall, a giant standing guard over the dismembered choir. Miller looked at the door, then at Arnold. He swallowed hard. Last chance to step aside, Miller whispered. Arnold did not move. He picked up the scalpel again, not to cut, but to hold. The metal caught the candlelight, flashing once. Open it, Arnold said. Miller turned the latch. The lock clicked, loud as a bone snapping, and the door began to swing inward, revealing the grey light of dawn and the silhouette of a man in a top hat standing against the fog. The tiles clicked under his boots, a sharp, hollow percussion echoing down the corridor of the St. George's Infirmary. Carbolic acid hung in the air, thick enough to taste, masking the underlying sourness of unwashed linen and old sickness. Arnold kept his head down, collar turned up against the damp seeping through the brickwork, though the cold had little to do with the weather outside. He had slipped out the back while Miller held the door, a deception that sat heavy in his gut, but the man in the top hat would not wait forever. 6 o'clock came round regardless of conscience. Can't help you, doctor. The clerk sat behind a high desk, ink staining his cuff, a ledger closed firmly under his palm. He did not look up from the column of figures he was totaling, the scratch of his nib the only sound in the room besides the distant coughing from the wards. I need the surgical register for 1883, Arnold said. Female admissions, orthopedic. Closed archive. The clerk dipped the pen. Order from the board required. I am the divisional surgeon for H Division. Arnold leaned forward, placing both hands on the wood. The varnish was chipped near the edge, revealing the grey grain beneath. A woman is dead on my slab. She has a scar on her knee. I need to know who cut her. The clerk stopped writing. He lifted his head slowly, eyes red-rimmed and weary, assessing Arnold not as a colleague, but as a nuisance. Plenty dead on slabs, doctor. Don't see them coming in here asking for books. This one might have a name. Then ask her. The clerk went back to the ledger. Next. Arnold straightened. His shoulders ached, a tight knot of tension between the shoulder blades that had been tightening since dawn. He could force the issue, threaten the man with the Metropolitan Police, but that would bring the yard into the infirmary, and the yard would bring delays. Delays meant burial. The sanitary imperative ticked louder than any clock. He stepped back. The floorboards creaked. Westminster, Arnold asked. Try Lambeth if they keep records. The clerk did not look up, observing that most do not, since fire took half the registers in 85. Arnold turned. The door handle was cold brass, biting into his palm. He pushed out into the street where the fog had thinned to grey drizzle, misting his spectacles immediately. He wiped them with a handkerchief already damp from the weather, smearing the grime rather than clearing it. The cab stand was empty. He walked. His boots splashed through puddles collecting in the ruts of the road, black water soaking the leather. 3 infirmaries in 2 hours. St. George's had refused. Westminster had lost the books to a fire, just as the clerk predicted, the charred remains of the ledger still sitting in a crate in the basement, smelling of smoke and ruin. Now Lambeth. The distance was considerable, and the morning was burning away, the grey light shifting towards the white glare of noon that would signal the end of the grace period. He reached the Lambeth workhouse gate at 10 minutes to 11. The building loomed, brick stained by coal smoke, windows narrow like slit eyes. Inside, the air was warmer, stagnant, carrying the scent of boiled cabbage and urine. A different clerk, this one younger, with spectacles sliding down a nose shiny with perspiration. Jackson, the young man flipped pages, the paper brittle and yellowing at the edges. Common name, hundreds of Jacksons. Female admitted for a tumor, left knee, surgeon's name might be listed. Arnold stood close, looming over the desk. He knew he looked desperate, knew the desperation smelled like sweat and old tobacco, but he could not step back. 4 years ago, autumn. Autumn covers 3 months, doctor. September, October. The clerk sighed, a long exhalation that fogged the air between them. He pulled a second ledger from the stack, dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the high window. The book thumped onto the desk, raising a small cloud of grit that made Arnold sneeze. Why this matter? The clerk ran a finger down the column of names. She's gone. She was someone. We're all someone, though that doesn't mean we get a line in the book. The clerk stopped, his finger hovering. Jackson, Elizabeth. Arnold held his breath. The room seemed to contract, the walls pressing in until only the page existed. Admitted October 1883, discharged November. The clerk tapped the entry. Operation noted, tumor removal, left leg. Show me. It's just ink, doctor. The clerk slid the book forward, same as the rest. Arnold looked. The handwriting was spidery, the ink faded to brown, but the initials of the surgeon were clear. HV, he knew that hand. He had seen it on death certificates, on admission forms, on the very scar tissue currently cooling on the enamel slab at Horseferry. The match was not perfect. Nothing ever was in this city of half-truths, but it was close enough to hang a name on. Elizabeth Jackson. The words formed in his mind, solid and heavy. No longer unknown female number 4. No longer Ash. I need an extract. Arnold reached for his pen. Certified. Can't do that. The clerk pulled the book back. Rules. I am taking it. Arnold's voice was low, devoid of threat, but absolute. He placed a coin on the desk, a sovereign that gleamed gold against the dull wood, for the inconvenience. The clerk looked at the coin, then at Arnold, before his gaze drifted to the door where the shadow of a porter was passing. Slowly, he covered the coin with his hand. 5 minutes. As the clerk tore a sheet from the pad, he commanded, "Write it yourself," before adding, "I saw nothing." Arnold wrote, the nib scratched, quick and jagged. Elizabeth Jackson, left knee, Oct 1883. He blew on the ink to dry it, folding the paper into a tight square that fit inside his waistcoat pocket against his heart. The paper was warm from his body heat immediately. Thank you. Don't thank me. The clerk shoved the ledger back onto the stack. Just go before the governor comes. Arnold turned. The walk back would take an hour. The cab ride less. He needed to move. The coffin would be waiting, the wood perhaps already nailed, the condensation staining the lid. He had the name, but the name was useless if the earth closed over the evidence before he could speak it aloud to the magistrate. He pushed through the door into the street. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the jagged skyline of the chimneys, but the air remained thick, choking. A hansom cab rattled past, wheels splashing mud onto the pavement. Arnold stepped out, arm raised, flagging it down. The driver pulled up, horse steaming in the cool air. Horseferry Road. Arnold opened the door. Double fare if you make it in 20 minutes. Roads blocked near the bridge. The driver looked back, eyes narrow, police gathering. Get me close. As Arnold climbed in, the cracked leather seat exhaled scents of rain and old tobacco. He clutched the waistcoat pocket where the paper lay, the name burning against his ribs, Elizabeth Jackson. She had a history, a surgeon, and a life before the river took her. The cab lurched forward, wheels spinning in the mud before catching hold. Arnold gripped the strap, body swaying with the motion. He checked his watch. 12 minutes past 11. The burial order expired at noon. He had less than an hour to return, to open the coffin, to show them the scar before the earth claimed her forever. The driver whipped the horse. The city blurred past, grey brick and grey sky merging into a single streak of motion. Arnold closed his eyes, seeing only the spidery ink on the page, the only proof that she had ever existed at all. They turned the corner onto Horseferry Road. The mortuary stood ahead, dark windows staring out like blind eyes. A crowd had gathered near the entrance, men in top hats, uniforms of the Metropolitan Police. A hearse waited, black paint gleaming, the rear doors open. Arnold tapped the roof. Stop. Can't stop here. Stop. The cab halted. Arnold threw the door open before it fully settled, jumping down into the mud. He ignored the splash, ignored the shouts from the crowd. He ran towards the door, hand inside his waistcoat, gripping the paper like a weapon. The entrance was blocked by 2 constables, arms crossed, faces impassive. Dr. Arnold, one stepped forward. Order's been signed, she's going. Not yet, Arnold pushed past, shoulder checking the man's chest. I have the identification. Too late for that, the constable reached for his arm. Step aside. Arnold shook him off. He reached the door. It was closed, locked. He could hear voices inside, low and urgent, Miller's voice, and another, deeper, authoritative. He put his hand on the latch. It was cold. Open it. The constable grabbed his shoulder. I said step aside. Arnold turned. He looked at the man, then at the hearse, then back at the door. He pulled the paper from his pocket. He held it up. Elizabeth Jackson, he said. The name hung in the air, sharp as a scalpel. Open the door. The constable hesitated. The name meant nothing to him, just ink on a page, but the look in Arnold's eyes gave him pause. He stepped back. Arnold turned the latch. The lock clicked. He pushed. The door swung inward, revealing the gaslit interior and the coffin sitting on the trolley, the wood already stained with the condensation of the cold room. He stepped inside. The air smelled of carbolic and fresh pine. Wait, Arnold said. The man in the top hat turned from the coffin. He held a hammer in his hand. The nail was half driven into the lid. You're late, Doctor. I have the name. Arnold walked forward, boots clicking on the tile. Open it. The lid sealed with a final, dull thud of the hammer, a sound that vibrated up through the soles of Arnold's boots and settled in his jaw. Take her, Arnold said. The men in black lifted the coffin. They did not look at him. They moved with the practiced, soulless efficiency of furniture removers, shuffling the box towards the hearse where the horse stamped, impatient to be done with the dead weight. Mud sucked at their heels. Arnold stood aside, pressing his back against the cold brick of the mortuary wall, watching the only truth he possessed vanish into the dark belly of the carriage. The name Elizabeth Jackson was safe in the ledger now, anchored by the scar on her knee and the clerk's trembling signature. But the rest of Hera, the butcher's work, the river's erosion, the industrial precision that had separated her from herself, was being committed to the earth before the sun could fully rise. Swift work, Doctor, the constable muttered, wiping his hands on a rag that was already stiff with grime. Governor'll be pleased to have the slot cleared. The slot, Arnold repeated. Space for the next one. The constable shrugged, turning away as the hearse doors slammed shut, cutting off the view of the pine box. Always another one coming down the tide. Arnold did not answer. He watched the vehicle lurch forward, wheels spinning briefly in the slick muck of Horseferry Road before finding purchase and rattling away towards the cemetery gates. The crowd dispersed instantly, the spectacle over, the morning's morbid curiosity satisfied by the sight of a closed coffin. They drifted back to their shops and stalls, leaving the surgeon alone on the pavement with the smell of wet coal dust and the fading echo of the horse's hooves. He needed air that did not taste of formalin. He needed to walk until the image of the sealed lid stopped burning behind his eyelids. Arnold turned his collar up against the damp and began the long trek south, away from the mortuary and towards the water's edge. The fog had not lifted so much as it had sunk, clinging to the ground like a low-hanging ceiling that blurred the distinction between the pavement and the river. He walked past the power station at Battersea, where the great chimneys exhaled thick, sulphurous plumes that mixed with the mist to create a choking grey broth. Here, the industrial heartbeat of London was loudest, a rhythmic clanking of machinery and the hiss of steam valves that drowned out the human voice. Barges lined the embankment, their hulls black and slick with oil, bobbing gently in the sluggish current. Men moved across the gangplanks, shoulders hunched under the weight of Hessian sacks. Coal dust coated their faces, turning them into grotesque puppets with white-rimmed eyes, and they worked with a frantic, repetitive motion that suggested a fear of stopping. Easy there, mate, one labourer grunted, shifting a bulging sack from his shoulder to the dockside cart. Don't drop the bloody lot. Shut it and lift, another snapped, grabbing the rope. Tide's turning in 20. Captain wants us cleared before the swell picks up. Arnold slowed his pace, feigning interest in a loose cobblestone while his eyes tracked the movement of the sacks. They were rough, woven from coarse hemp, stained dark with river water and grease. A man could fit a human arm in one, a leg if bent at the knee, a torso if the head was removed. He watched a laborer hoist a particularly heavy bundle, the fabric straining against the contents, and felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The man grunted, adjusted his grip, and swung the sack onto the pile without a second glance at what he carried. It was the banality of it that sickened him. There was no drama, no furtive glancing over shoulders, no nervous twitching of hands. If a killer had walked this same path 3 nights ago, carrying the dismembered fragments of Elizabeth Jackson in a bag just like this, he would have been invisible. He would have been just another shadow in the fog, another pair of boots in the mud, swallowed by the sheer, overwhelming volume of the city's waste. The river did not just hide the dead, it camouflaged the murder in the everyday grind of survival. Arnold stepped closer to the edge of the wharf, the smell of rotting kelp and raw sewage rising to meet him. A group of dockworkers had gathered near a capstan, taking a brief respite with clay pipes clamped between yellowed teeth. They watched him approach with the sullen hostility of men who regarded any outsider as a threat to their fragile routine. "Evening," Arnold said, stopping a few feet away. He kept his hands visible, palms open. "I'm looking for information regarding a parcel found near these pilings earlier in the week." The silence that descended was heavier than the fog. One man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. Another stared fixedly at the toe of his boot. "Parcel?" the first man asked, his voice rough, devoid of inflection. "We move tons of parcels a day, Governor. Coal, offal, bones for the glue factory. You'll have to be more specific." "A human parcel," Arnold said, keeping his tone level, clinical. "Severed remains, wrapped in brown paper perhaps, or a cloth of some kind. Did anyone see anything unusual on Tuesday night? A man alone? A cart stopped where it shouldn't be." The pipe smoker took a long drag, the cherry of his tobacco glowing bright orange in the gloom before fading again. He exhaled a cloud of acrid smoke that drifted between them. "Tuesday night was like every other night," he said, "dark and wet and full of work." "Surely someone noticed," Arnold pressed, taking a step forward as he insisted that since the police say the tide was high and the water would have been close to the walkway, someone must have seen a figure near the edge. "We don't look at the water," the second man said, finally lifting his eyes. They were flat, empty pools that reflected nothing. "We look at our feet, watch where you step, or you end up in it yourself. That's all we see." "I'm offering a reward," Arnold said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth as he forced them out, "for useful information." He needed anything that helped identify who put those remains in the river. "Keep your coin," the first man muttered, turning his back. "We got enough trouble without talking to the coppers' friends." "I am not a policeman," Arnold said, his voice sharpening as he added that he was a surgeon who was trying to. "Doesn't matter what you are," the man cut in without looking back, insisting that they see nothing and hear nothing, and certainly know nothing about any parcels. The dismissal was absolute, a wall of brick and mortar built from years of knowing that silence was the only currency that held value on the docks. Arnold stood there for a moment, the wind biting through his coat, realizing the futility of his position. He was a man of science trying to reason with a culture of survival, asking for truth in a place where truth was a liability. The killer had not just relied on the fog, he had relied on this. He had counted on the omert tilde of the poor, the unspoken agreement that nothing seen was ever acknowledged, lest the attention of the authorities fall upon their own desperate struggles. Arnold nodded once, a stiff, mechanical gesture. "Very well." He turned away, the rejection settling in his chest like a stone. As he walked back towards the road, the sounds of the dock resumed behind him, the grunting of men, the slap of wet ropes, the creak of timber, but none of them looked up. They had already erased him, just as they had erased the woman in the sack, just as the river would erase them all in time. The walk back to Vincent Square was a blur of grey streets and gas lamps that fought a losing battle against the encroaching dusk. By the time Arnold reached his study, the fire had died down to a bed of glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the bookshelves. He shrugged off his coat, hanging it on the stand with trembling hands and moved to his desk. The room was quiet, save for the settling of the house and the distant rumble of a carriage on the main road. Here, amidst the orderly rows of medical texts and the neat stacks of his journals, the chaos of the embankment felt distant, almost unreal. But the anger remained, a hot, coiling presence in his gut. He sat down and pulled a sheet of paper towards him, dipping his pen into the inkwell. He began to sketch the layout of the Battersea shore, marking the position of the pilings, the height of the tide, the location of the labourers. He drew lines representing the current, trying to triangulate where the remains had entered the water, but the map refused to yield its secrets. The fog he had walked through seemed to have migrated onto the page, obscuring the logic he desperately sought. Every entry point was possible, every exit was plausible. The river offered no coordinates, only a vast, fluid anonymity that mocked his attempts at precision. A sharp rap on the door broke his concentration. "Enter," Arnold called, not looking up. His housekeeper pushed the door open, holding a silver tray with a single envelope upon it. "Post came for you, sir. Special delivery from the yard." Arnold took the envelope, his fingers brushing the official crest stamped in red wax. He recognized the handwriting of the chief inspector immediately, a sprawling, confident script that suggested a man who never doubted his own authority. He slit the seal with his thumbnail and unfolded the letter. The words swam before his eyes, crisp and formal. Commendation, swift resolution, closure of the Jackson file, no further expenditure authorized. They had the name, they had the body. To them, the case was solved. The mystery of Elizabeth Jackson was reduced to an administrative checkmark, a file closed and shelved, freeing up resources for the next public disturbance. There was no mention of the dismemberment, no inquiry into the source of the remains, no acknowledgement that the woman had been cut apart with a surgeon's skill and dumped like refuse. The bureaucracy had done what it always did. It had taken the smallest possible truth and used it to bury the larger, more uncomfortable lies. Arnold read the letter twice, then a third time. The paper felt heavy in his hand, weighted with the indifference of an empire that valued order over justice. "Sir," the housekeeper hovered in the doorway, "shall I bring tea?" "No," Arnold said, his voice low, dangerous. "Leave us." She retreated, closing the door softly behind her. Arnold stood up and walked to the fireplace. He knelt before the grate, where the embers still glowed with a sullen, orange heat. He held the letter over the flames, watching the paper curl and blacken as the fire licked at the edges. The commendation turned to ash, flaking away into the darkness of the chimney, carried upward by the draught. He watched until the last fragment disintegrated, leaving nothing but a faint wisp of smoke. The file was closed for Scotland Yard, but for him, for the ghost of Elizabeth Jackson who now lay in a box under 6 feet of cold earth, the work was far from finished. The river had taken her pieces, and the city had swallowed the truth, but Arnold remained. He sat back on his heels, staring into the dying fire, the silence of the room pressing in around him, heavy with the weight of the unsaid. The knock arrived not as a request, but as an intrusion, 3 sharp raps that cut through the smoke of his study and pinned him to the chair. Arnold did not move immediately. He let the sound hang in the air, a brittle assertion of urgency that clashed with the dying embers in the grate. Outside, the fog had thickened, pressing against the sash windows until the glass sweated with condensation, blurring the gas lamps of Vincent Square into smeared halos of sickly yellow. "Sir," the voice came muffled through the wood, tight with a reluctance that suggested the bearer of the message wished to be anywhere else. "Constable Miller from Horseferry says it's urgent, says the tide's turned at Chelsea." Arnold stood. The movement pulled at the stiff collar of his shirt, a friction against skin that felt too hot, too clammy. He walked to the door and opened it, finding the constable standing on the threshold, hat in hand, water dripping from the brim onto the polished floorboards. The man smelled of the river, a raw, metallic tang of brine and rotting kelp that instantly overpowered the scent of coal dust and old paper in the hallway. "Chelsea?" Arnold asked. The word felt heavy on his tongue, a stone dropped into a well. "I doctor near the old church wharf." Miller shifted his weight, his boots squeaking on the wet wood as he added that it was wrapped in sacking, same as the other, though this one was bigger. Inspector Thorne sent me. He explained that the inspector said the doctor would want to see it before the coroner got his hands on it, noting specifically that the cuts were clean. Clean. The adjective landed with the weight of a verdict. Arnold grabbed his coat from the stand, shoving his arms into the sleeves without bothering with the buttons. He snatched his medical bag from the desk, the leather handle cold and familiar in his grip. "Wait outside," Arnold said. "I'll be down." The cab ride was a blur of jolting wheels and swaying lanterns, the horse struggling against the slick cobbles as they navigated the maze of streets towards the river. Arnold sat in silence, staring at the condensation tracing paths down the windowpane, his mind already dissecting the possibilities. Bigger. The word looped in his head, a frantic rhythm that matched the clatter of hooves. If it was bigger, it meant more mass. More mass meant more surface area for the water to act upon, more tissue to swell, more time lost to the decay clock before he could even make the first incision. And if the cuts were clean, it meant the hand was steady. It meant the same hand. He pushed the thought away, locking it behind the professional mask he wore like armor. Speculation was for the police. His job was the slab. The truth lived in the flesh, not the theories. When they arrived at the Chelsea wharf, the scene was a tableau of grim efficiency. A group of dockworkers stood in a semicircle, their faces obscured by scarves and low caps, smoking pipes that glowed like angry eyes in the gloom. They parted as Arnold approached, their silence heavy with a shared, unspoken knowledge. They had seen this before. They would see it again. Thorne waited by the mortuary van, his face pale under the glare of a portable gas lamp that hissed and sputtered in the damp air. He nodded as Arnold drew near, a gesture devoid of warmth. "Inside, Doctor," Thorne said, gesturing to the rear of the van where they hadn't moved it yet, for he wanted the doctor to see the wrapping. Arnold climbed into the van, the wooden floor slippery with mud and river slime. The parcel lay on a stretcher, a bulky shape bound in coarse hessian that had turned dark and sodden with the tide. The smell hit him first, and not just the generic stench of decomposition, but something sharper, sweeter, cloying like overripe fruit left in the sun. It was the scent of a body that had begun its work on itself, the internal gases bloating the tissues from within. He knelt beside the stretcher, pulling a pair of gloves from his bag. The latex snapped against his wrists, a sharp sound in the confined space. "Cut it," Thorne said from the doorway, his voice flat, "but don't damage the fiber, for we might get something from the twine." Arnold picked up his scalpel. The blade caught the light, a sliver of silver against the brown sack. He made a single, precise incision down the center of the bundle, the sound of tearing fabric loud in the quiet van. He peeled back the layers of wet hessian, exposing the contents beneath. It was a torso, female. The skin was waxy and pale, marbled with the greenish-black veins of advanced decomposition, but the form was unmistakable. The arms were tucked tight against the ribs, bound with the same thick rope he had seen on the Battersea remains, tied in the same complex, nautical knot that spoke of a hand practiced in the rigging of ships or the trussing of meat. But it was the cut that stopped him. The separation at the neck was smooth, a single plane of severance that left the vertebrae exposed like white pearls in a broken necklace. There was no hacking, no jagged edges where an amateur might have struggled with the bone. This was surgical, precise, deliberate. "Not Jackson," Arnold murmured, the words escaping before he could check them. Thorne leaned in, squinting against the glare of the lamp. "How can you be sure?" She's swollen half again her size. "Jackson had a scar," Arnold said, his voice gaining strength as the clinical details flooded his mind, pushing back the rising tide of nausea. "On the left clavicle, from a childhood burn, this skin is unmarked, and the tissue density." He pressed a gloved finger against the abdomen, feeling the yielding resistance of the bloated flesh. Jackson was older, frailer. This woman was younger, stronger. Look at the muscle definition in the arms. Despite the swelling, you can see the striations. "She worked, she lifted." He moved his hands over the remains, tracing the line of the ribs, checking the abdomen for signs of pregnancy or surgery. Nothing, no scars, no distinctive marks, just the flawless, terrifying precision of the dismemberment. "She's fresh," Arnold said, pulling his hand away and wiping it on a rag. Less than 24 hours in the water, maybe less. The tide brought her in quickly. Same killer? Thorne asked. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications neither man wanted to voice. Arnold looked at the knot binding the arms. He looked at the clean cut of the neck. He thought of the files in his drawer, the neat diagrams of Elizabeth Jackson's reconstructed form, the way the pieces had fit together with such horrible logic. The method is identical, Arnold said quietly. The wrapping, the knot, the instrument used. Whoever did this knows anatomy. They know how to separate the joints without damaging the bone. They know how to wrap a body so it floats until the tide releases it. He stood up, his knees cracking in the silence of the van. The air inside felt thick, suffocating, charged with the presence of a second victim who would never have a name, never have a family to claim her, never have justice served in a court of law. Take her to Horseferry, Arnold said, stripping off his gloves and dropping them onto the stretcher. I'll meet you there. Don't let anyone touch her until I arrive. And Thorne. The inspector paused, his hand on the van door. Yes, doctor. Send a telegram to Surrey Police. Tell them to check their missing persons logs for the last 3 days. Young female, strong build, likely domestic service or factory work. Thorne nodded, a grin set to his jaw, insisting it won't matter. They'll say she ran off. They always do. Then let them say it, Arnold replied, stepping down from the van and onto the slick mud of the wharf. But I will know, and I will record it. He turned away from the van, walking towards the edge of the embankment where the black water lapped against the pilings. The sound was rhythmic, a wet, sucking noise that sounded disturbingly like breathing. He stared into the dark current, imagining the other pieces drifting somewhere in the deep, waiting for the next turn of the tide to deliver them to the shore. The choir had grown. One voice was no longer a tragedy, it was an anomaly. 2 voices were a pattern. And patterns, Arnold knew with a cold certainty that settled in his bones, demanded an audience. He buttoned his coat against the chill and began the walk back to his cab, the image of the seamless neck cut burning in his mind, a silent testament to a killer who was already preparing the next verse. Carbolic acid strung the air, sharp enough to taste on the back of the tongue. Arnold scrubbed his hands at the sink, the bristles of the nail brush tearing at cuticles until the skin roared and pink. He needed the pain. It grounded him against the cloying sweetness of bloating flesh, which clung to the fingernails like a second skin no amount of scrubbing could remove. Thorne waited near the door, smoking a cigarette whose smoke curled blue and thin into the corner where the shadows gathered thickest. Bring her out, Arnold said. He dried his hands on a rough towel, the fabric scratching against the dampness. 2 attendants wheeled the stretcher from the cold room. The sheet draped over the form bulged unevenly, hiding the geometry of the dismemberment beneath a sterile white lie. They transferred the remains to the enamel slab with a wet slap that echoed off the tiled walls. Arnold pulled the sheet back. The torso lay grey and swollen under the single gas jet. Same wrapping? Thorne asked. He flicked ash onto the floor, not bothering to find a tray. Hessian twine, the knot is identical. Arnold leaned over the body, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the white enamel. He traced the line of the shoulder where the arm had been severed. Look at the angle of the incision. It enters from the rear, slopes downward, just like Jackson. Could be any butcher. Thorne took a drag, the ember flaring bright in the dim room, before he added that men cut meat the same way all over London, since it's a trade skill. Butchers do not wrap their offal in new sackcloth and tie it with surgeon's hitches. Arnold reached for his ledger, the leather cover worn smooth at the corners from constant handling. He opened it to the pages dedicated to Elizabeth Jackson, the ink still glossy where he had added notes only weeks prior. Jackson's remains were found at Battersea, this woman at Chelsea, different jurisdictions, different police divisions, but the same hand. Thorne stepped closer, peering at the diagrams. The drawings were precise, devoid of sentiment, rendering the horror in clean lines and measured annotations. You want me to put that in a report? Thorne asked. His voice dropped, losing its edge. Say there's a man cutting women up and dropping them in the tide. I want you to link the cases. As Arnold tapped the page, he warned that treating them as separate drownings would make us lose the pattern, and if we lost the pattern, he would continue. Thorne laughed, a short, dry sound. While it could be a woman or perhaps a gang, the specific identity doesn't matter. The commissioner won't like it. Since panic sells papers, doctor, and panic makes the Home Office ask questions we can't answer, the outcome remains the same. I am not asking for the papers. Arnold picked up his pen, the nib hovering over a fresh sheet of notepaper. I am asking for justice. Justice costs money. Thorne pushed off the doorframe, crushing the cigarette under his boot heel. And time, we haven't got either. Bury her as unknown female. Let the family wonder, it's kinder. Kindness is not my remit. Arnold began to write. The scratch of the nib was loud in the quiet room, a rhythmic counterpoint to the drip of the tap. Subject, second recovery, method, identical to case 8744 Jackson. This woman worked. She had muscle mass. She was not a drifter. Someone knew her, someone missed her. Nobody misses the poor Thomas, Thorne said, using his Christian name in a rare slip that served as a warning. They vanish into the fog and the river takes them. That's the order of things. Arnold stopped writing. The ink pooled at the end of the sentence, a dark blot expanding slowly. He looked at the body on the slab. The face was gone, taken by the water or the knife, leaving only a smooth ruin where features should have been. Without a name, she was nothing, a number in a ledger, a burden on the ratepayer. He looked back at his report, where the words potential serial offender sat absurd on the page, grandiose and impossible to prove. Scotland Yard would laugh, calling it hysteria, while insisting the divisional surgeon had spent too many hours alone with the dead. The gas jet hissed. A moth beat itself against the glass chimney, a frantic tapping sound like a fingernail seeking entry. Give it a week, Thorne said. He moved towards the door, hand on the latch. Find a name, then we talk. Until then, this stays between us. If I wait a week, the evidence rots. Arnold's voice remained flat. You know the decay clock, 48 hours before the tissues swell beyond recognition. We are already past that. Then bury the evidence. Thorne opened the door. The corridor beyond was dark, smelling of dust and old paper. Do your job, doctor. Examine the dead. Let us handle the living. The door clicked shut. Arnold stood alone with the corpse, the silence pressing against his ears, heavy and physical, as he looked at the report in front of him. The warning. The truth was a dangerous thing to hold. If he sent it, he would be ignored, yet if he kept it, he was complicit. He folded the paper, once, twice. The creases were sharp, biting into his thumb. Opening the desk drawer, he placed the folded warning inside. It landed on top of Jackson's file, a layer of truth buried beneath another. He turned the key in the lock. The metal tumblers clicked home with a finality that echoed in his chest. There was no sense in shouting into a void that refused to carry sound. The bureaucracy would digest the body, issue a certificate, and close the file. The river would keep its secrets. He was bound by the limits of his science and the indifference of his masters. Arnold blew out the gas jet. The room plunged into grey twilight, the shapes of the instruments gleaming faintly in the gloom. He packed his bag, the leather creaking as he snapped the latches. Walking to the window, he pressed his palm against the cold glass. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the street lamps until they were nothing but vague halos in the murk. He listened. Beyond the traffic, beyond the distant shout of a costermonger, there was a sound. The river. It lapped against the embankment walls, a rhythmic, wet breathing that seemed to promise more deliveries to come as long as the fog persisted. Arnold turned from the window and picked up his bag. The choir had grown, and he was the only one left holding the sheet music. A rap on the wood, sharp, impatient. Arnold froze, hands still resting on the cold windowpane. The bag hung heavy at his side, leather straps digging into his palm. He did not turn immediately. Another knock, louder this time, followed by the rattle of the latch being tested from the corridor side. Open up, doctor. Know you're in there. The voice belonged to the street, roughened by smoke and cheap gin. Arnold set the bag down on the table, the thud echoing off the tiled walls. He struck a match against his trouser leg, the sulfur flare biting at the gloom, and relit the central gas jet. The flame sputtered into life, casting long, dancing shadows that made the instruments on the tray gleam like hidden teeth. He walked to the door and drew the bolts. The man who pushed inside wore a bowler hat crushed low over eyes that darted too quickly for a gentleman. Wet wool clung to his shoulders, steaming in the warmth of the room, and he carried a notebook bound in red cloth that looked fresh from the printer. Behind him, the corridor lights spilled across the flags, illuminating the mud tracked from the street. Divisional Surgeon Arnold. "We are closed." Arnold moved to stand between the visitor and the slab. The linen sheet covering the remains hung straight, hiding the ruin beneath. Official business only. "Name's Holloway, the star." Although the reporter stepped forward anyway, his boots squeaking on the damp stone, he flipped open the notebook with pencil poised. "Heard you had another one. Fishermen talking down at Battersea say it's the same as the Chelsea find." Fishermen talk too much. Arnold kept his hands clasped behind his back, hiding the tremor that had started in his left thumb. Accidental drowning, body fragmented by the propellers of passing steamers, standard procedure. "Propellers don't tie knots, Doctor." Holloway scribbled something down, though he hadn't written a word yet. "And they don't remove specific organs with surgical precision. People are saying there's a butcher walking the embankments." "People say many things." Arnold shifted his weight, blocking the reporter's view of the shelves where the jars of preserved tissue stood in rows. "Most of it nonsense. The river damages flesh. It obscures truth. That is my job to clarify, not to speculate." "Speculation sells papers." Holloway looked past Arnold's shoulder, trying to catch a glimpse of the covered form. "Is it the Jackson woman again, or a new victim? The lads at the dock say this one was wrapped in oilcloth." Arnold felt the locked drawer behind him like a physical weight against his spine. The warning he had just concealed sat inches away, a secret that could burn them both if breathed aloud. He maintained his expression, a mask of clinical boredom perfected over 20 years of cutting open the paw. The lie tasted of copper. Elizabeth Jackson was identified and buried. While the words hung heavy, he forced out the next claim, stating this is an unknown male, a laborer who fell from a wharf. "Male," Holloway paused, his pencil hovering in the air. He had heard it was a female, given the dress fragments found in the mud. "Deception of the tide," Arnold said, taking a step forward that forced the reporter to retreat. "Clothing drifts while bodies sink, and you are wasting your time, Mr. Holloway, for there is no story here beyond the usual tragedy of the waterfront." "The commissioner thinks there's a story," Holloway said, snapping the notebook shut so that the sound cracked like a pistol shot in the small room. "Why else would they be holding back the details? Why the silence from H Division?" "Sanitary regulations." Arnold pointed to the door, citing public health concerns and the mandate that findings remain unpublished until the coroner sits. "You know the law." "I know the law changes when the readers get frightened." Though Holloway did not move, he stared at the linen sheet with a gaze that was heavy and accusatory. "If you're hiding something, Doctor, someone else will print it. It might not come from you, but perhaps from the constables on the beat or the washerwomen who find the rags." "Then let them print it." Arnold's voice dropped, shedding its professional polish to reveal the exhaustion beneath, yet he held firm, "Not from this room, not from his mouth." Holloway studied him for a long moment, searching for a crack in the armor. The gaslight flickered, casting a yellow pallor over Arnold's face that made him look like one of his own cadavers. Finally, the reporter shoved the notebook into his pocket. "Suit yourself." Holloway turned, pulling his coat collar up against the smell of the mortuary. "But when the next one washes up, and they always do, don't come crying to the press for sympathy. We remember who locked the door." He walked out, leaving the door ajar. The corridor light sliced across the floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air. Arnold waited until the outer gate clanged shut before moving to close the entrance. He pushed the wood until the latch clicked, sealing the room once more. The silence returned, but it felt different now, thinner, violated. Arnold walked back to the desk and sat down. The chair creaked under his weight, a mundane sound in a room dedicated to the end of things. He opened the drawer and retrieved the leather-bound journal, the pages stiff with use. His fingers traced the dates written in his own tight script, moving backward from the current entry. August 12th brings Battersea, followed by Chelsea on the 28th, until September 5th lands at Horseferry. He tapped the nib against the paper, leaving a small ink stain beside the last date. The intervals were shrinking. The river was giving them up faster than the earth could swallow them down. He looked at the covered slab, then back at the journal, realizing the pattern was no longer a theory hidden in a locked drawer, but a countdown ticking on the page. Carbolic acid strung the back of the throat, a chemical bite that failed to mask the underlying sweetness of rot. Thomas Arnold stood over the slab. His hands hovered above the arranged fragments, trembling slightly until he clasped them together to still the shake. Cold porcelain leached the warmth from his palms. "Doctor!" Jedge stood by the sink, wiping a scalpel with a rag that had seen better decades. The fabric hung in greasy strips. "Nearly done," Arnold said. "Nearly doesn't bury them," Jedge said, tossing the rag into the bucket where it landed with a wet slap. "Sanitary inspector comes at first light, you know the regulation." "I know the law." Arnold picked up the left leg. The tissue had swollen, bloated by the river's embrace until the skin shone like wet parchment. He positioned it against the thigh fragment, aligning the jagged edge of the femur with the precision of a watchmaker fitting a gear. But they deserve to be whole before the earth takes them, even if only for an hour. Jedge sighed, a rough sound like gravel shifting in a box, then leaned against the wall with arms thick with old scars crossed over his chest. "Whole doesn't matter to the cholera board. What matters is 6 feet under, and it must be quick." "Leave me. You'll be here all night." "Then I shall be here." Arnold pressed the flesh together. It did not knit. The gap remained, a dark mouth refusing to close. He reached for the pins. Silver needles glinted in the gaslight. One by one, he drove them through the skin, anchoring the illusion of continuity. His movements were ritualistic, slow, each puncture a silent apology to the woman whose name he would never know. Unlike Elizabeth Jackson, this one had no mole, no scar, no scrap of clothing to anchor her to the living world. She was merely flesh, waterlogged, heavy. The gas flare above flickered, dipping low enough to cast the room into momentary grey before surging back. Shadows stretched across the floor, long and thin like grasping fingers. Arnold ignored them. He focused on the knee. A surgical scar ran across the joint, neat and professional. He traced it with a gloved thumb. Someone had cared for this woman once. A hospital, perhaps. A record somewhere in a clerk's ledger gathering dust in Lambeth. "Jackson had a scar," Arnold murmured. "Jackson had a name," Jedge corrected as he pushed off the wall, stepping closer to inspect the work. "This one, she's nobody, just another parcel the tide washed up." "Everybody is somebody." Arnold stepped back. The reconstruction stood complete, a patchwork quilt of human remains stitched together with silver and hope. 7 fragments, 2 torsos, 4 limbs, a head that refused to stay upright without support. He propped it with a rolled towel. "Fetch the sheet." "The blue one. The clean white one." Jedge hesitated, then moved to the cupboard. He pulled out a folded linen sheet, crisp and stark against the gloom. He tossed it to Arnold. The fabric unfolded in midair, settling over the remains like snow covering a grave. The contours disappeared. The horror vanished beneath the cloth. Only the shape remained. "Tomorrow they go," Jedge said. His voice dropped, losing its edge. "Mass grave, pauper's plot, no marker." "I know." Arnold smoothed the sheet over the face. He lingered there, his hand resting on the place where the eyes would be. "But tonight they are Elizabeth. Tonight they are whole." "You're tired, Doctor." "I am accurate." Arnold turned away from the slab. His boots clicked on the tile, sharp sounds in the heavy air. He walked to the desk where the leather-bound journal lay open. The pages waited, blank and accusing. Ink dried in the well, black and viscous. He dipped the pen. The nib scratched against the paper, a dry rasp that echoed in the room. "Jedge. So." "Lock the outer door. No one enters until I finish this entry." The constable said, The constable waits. Arnold did not look up. He wrote the date. October 1887. The ink flowed, forming letters that documented the truth without speculation. He described the scar on the knee, the condition of the lungs, the absence of identification. He refused to write about the killer. He refused to write about the fog. The slab was the only truth available. The rest was noise. Jedge moved to the door. The bolt slid home with a heavy clunk. 10 minutes, doctor. Then I send for the boxes. 10 minutes. The scratch of the pen continued. Arnold wrote until his hand cramped, filling the page with facts that would soon be buried. He thought of the river outside, dark and churning against the embankment. It did not care about his journal. It did not care about the scar on the knee. It would take more. The tide turned twice a day, and with it came the offerings. He paused. The nib hovered over the paper. A single drop of ink swelled at the tip, threatening to fall. He held it there. The room waited. The sheet on the slab remained undisturbed. The silence pressed against his ears, a physical weight that demanded to be filled with words. He lowered the pen. The ink touched the page. The line continued. Outside, the fog thickened against the windows, blurring the line between the living city and the drowning dead. Arnold wrote on. He knew the sanitary imperative would demand the burial tomorrow. He knew the police would file the report and forget the nameless woman. He knew the river would keep its secrets. But here, in the sterile light of the mortuary, he could bear witness. He could make them whole for one night. Jedge shifted by the door, the wood creaking under his weight. Doctor, the van. Arnold paused. The nib hovered over the paper. He held it there, suspended between the record and the grave. Let them wait, Arnold said, his voice quiet yet carrying through the space. I am not finished. You said 10 minutes. As Jedge stepped into the light, holding a coffin lid, the constable outside began knocking because he wanted the yard clear. Arnold looked at the journal. The entry was incomplete. The sentence hung unfinished, a clause without a resolution. He looked at the slab. The linen sheet remained undisturbed. The bodies inside were cooling, settling into the final rigidity that no amount of surgical skill could reverse. He capped the inkwell. The click sounded like a gunshot. Take them, Arnold said. He pushed the journal away, sliding it towards the edge of the desk where the shadows could hide it. Bury them. Let the earth do what the law requires. Jedge nodded once. He signaled to the door. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the corridor, men coming to carry the dead. Arnold stood. He watched as the coffins were lifted, the wood groaning under the weight of the waterlogged flesh. They moved past him, out into the night where the fog waited to swallow them whole. He walked to the door. He locked it behind them. The key turned in the lock with a solid, final clunk. He stood in the empty room, the gas jet hissing softly above. The slab was bare now, scrubbed clean for the next delivery. He turned off the light. The darkness rushed in, complete and absolute. He walked out into the cool night air, the sound of the key turning in the lock echoing like a final verdict, and he accepted that his duty was not to solve the mystery, but to bear witness to the silence of the river. As he walked away into the fog, the river continued its slow, wet breathing against the embankment, indifferent to the lives it had taken and the man who tried to count them, promising that the choir would sing again when the tide turned. The bolt slid back with a grind of rusted iron that set Arnold's teeth on edge, a sound like bone dragging against stone. Clear the way, Jedge muttered, stepping aside as the first constable shouldered the door open. 2 men from the H Division entered, their boots leaving wet prints on the scrubbed tiles, carrying the rough pine boxes that smelled of fresh sap and cheap varnish. They moved with the efficient indifference of men who had carried nothing but dead weight for years, their faces blank masks under the sickly yellow glare of the gas jet. Arnold stood by his desk, hands clasped behind his back, fingers digging into his own wrists to keep them still. He watched as they approached the slab, the linen sheet still draped over the reconstruction he had spent the last 4 hours stitching together with silver wire and desperate hope. Lift together, the taller constable ordered, his voice flat, devoid of any reverence for the geometry of flesh beneath the cloth. They grabbed the corners of the sheet, bunching the fabric in rough fists, and hoisted the bundle. The shape sagged in the middle, the head lolling to one side where the neck had been severed, a limp puppet discarded by a careless child. The wood of the coffin groaned as they lowered it, the sound echoing in the small room like a sigh. Arnold flinched, a microscopic twitch of the shoulder, as the lid was nailed shut with 3 sharp strikes of a hammer that sent vibrations shivering through the floorboards and up into the soles of his boots. 1 down, 6 to go. The process repeated itself, a mechanical ritual that stripped the dignity from the dead with terrifying speed. Box after box, the remains of the unknown women were swallowed by the pine, each nail drive a period at the end of a sentence Arnold had tried desperately to leave unfinished. He counted the strikes. 3 for the torso found at Battersea, 3 for the leg washed up near the power station, 3 for the arm that had tangled in the reeds at Chelsea. The rhythm was relentless, a staccato beat that drowned out the scratching of his own thoughts, reducing the complex tragedy of 7 lost lives to a simple inventory of wooden crates. "Steady with that one," Jedge warned, eyeing the box containing the head. "It's heavy." "It's all the same weight in the end," the constable replied, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy sleeve. "Earth don't care if it's a head or a heel." Arnold opened his mouth, the words "she was a mother" rising in his throat, bitter and useless, before he swallowed them back down. To speak would be to break the silence that protected him, to invite the bureaucracy to question his attachment, to risk the very license that allowed him to stand in this room and bear witness. He remained mute, a statue in a black coat, watching as the men stacked the coffins against the wall, a pyramid of pine that represented the sum total of his autumn's labor. 7 boxes, 7 names that would never appear in the papers, 7 souls reduced to a line item in the sanitary inspector's ledger marked "disposal complete." The air in the room grew thick, the carbolic acid failing now to mask the sweet, cloying scent of decomposition that seeped from the wood grain. It was the smell of forgotten things, of meat left too long in the heat, a pungent reminder that the sanitary imperative cared nothing for justice, only for the prevention of cholera and the comfort of the living. Arnold breathed it in, letting it coat his lungs, a penance for his inability to do more than document the decay. "Right," the lead constable said, clapping his hands together, the sound sharp and final. "That's the lot. We'll have these down to the cart." They lifted the stack, 2 men taking the weight while the third cleared the path, shuffling out into the corridor with the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on stone. Jedge followed, holding the door open, his face shadowed, unreadable. Arnold did not move to help. He did not offer a word of thanks or a nod of farewell. He simply stood, anchored to the spot by the gravity of the empty slab behind him, watching as the physical evidence of the crime vanished from his sight, carried away to a pauper's pit where the earth would close over them like a wound healing over. "Doctor," Jedge paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame. "You coming?" "In a moment," Arnold said, his voice sounding thin and stripped of the authority he usually commanded. "Leave the light." Jedge hesitated, then nodded, pulling the door shut until only a sliver of the corridor remained visible. The footsteps faded, receding down the hall towards the yard, replaced by the distant rumble of a wagon wheel on cobblestones and the muffled shout of a driver urging his horse forward. Arnold was alone. The room felt vast now, the shadows stretching long and thin across the tiles, reaching for the bare enamel of the slab which gleamed under the gas jet, scrubbed clean and waiting. He walked to the desk. The journal lay open, the ink on the final page still wet, glistening like a fresh scar. He ran a finger along the edge of the paper, feeling the texture of the pulp, the roughness of the truth he had committed to it. Unknown female, approximate age 30, scar on left knee consistent with surgical intervention. The words stared back at him, inadequate and stark, a fragile shield against the overwhelming tide of oblivion. He closed the book, the leather cover making a soft thump against the wood, and slid it into the top drawer, locking it with a small brass key that he slipped into his waistcoat pocket. The key to the mortuary door sat on the desk beside the inkwell. He picked it up, the metal cold and heavy in his palm, etched with the number of the division. It was a simple object, unremarkable, yet it held the power to seal this sanctuary off from the world, to separate the clean, ordered reality of the slab from the chaotic, fog-choked streets outside. He turned towards the door, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness, a solitary rhythm in the quiet room. He pushed the door open and stepped into the corridor, the air here cooler, tinged with the damp chill of the night that seeped through the brickwork. Jedge was gone, likely already down in the yard supervising the loading. Arnold walked to the outer door, the heavy oak barrier that stood between him and the river. He pushed it open, the hinges complaining with a low moan, and stepped out onto the pavement. The fog hit him instantly, a physical wall of grey moisture that clung to his skin and soaked into his coat, blurring the gas lamps into hazy orbs of light. The street was empty, the wagon already departed, leaving only the faint scent of horse dung and wet wood hanging in the air. He turned back to the door, inserting the key into the lock. The mechanism engaged with a solid metallic click, a sound that resonated deep in his chest, final and absolute. He turned the key, feeling the tumblers fall into place, sealing the dead inside with their silence. He stood there for a moment, hand resting on the cold iron of the handle, listening. Beyond the thick walls, beyond the fog, he could hear it. The Thames. It lapped against the embankment nearby, a slow, wet breathing that never ceased, indifferent to the boxes now rattling in the back of a cart on their way to the grave, indifferent to the journal locked in his drawer, indifferent to the man standing on the pavement trying to convince himself that he had done enough. Arnold pulled his collar up against the damp, turning away from the door. He began to walk, his boots clicking on the wet stones, the sound swallowed quickly by the mist. The river breathed on, a constant, rhythmic promise that the tide would turn again, and when it did, it would bring more offerings to the shore, more fragments for the choir, more silence for the slab. He walked into the grey, a solitary figure dissolving into the fog, carrying the weight of the names he knew and the thousands he would never learn, stepping forward into the dark while the water waited, patient and hungry, for the next delivery. The river's dismembered choir is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. In the mind of a female serial killer, Internet Archive. Thames Torso Murders. Torso Murders. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.